I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. It's time to take a look at the Reagan administration. As we go through the slides, you should have out the Google Doc where you get an opportunity to fill out some of the key points along the way. Make sure you get all that filled out. And when you're done viewing both my lesson and filling out the Google Doc, you should submit that in Google Classroom. As we move forward, we'll be seeing primarily the background information on Ronald Reagan and get an idea of where his support came from and how he would go on to become president of the United States after winning the 1980 presidential election. First of all, when you look at the 1980s, we're really seeing a resurgence and an emergence of the conservative movement for the first time. So we're just going to kind of take a look at a kind of a compare and contrast between the democratic liberal views on society and government versus that of the conservative views. The two candidates who are going to face off in the 1980 presidential election are kind of poster childs for a traditional liberal candidate in Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, and a very strong and traditional conservative candidate in Ronald Reagan. These are all generalities, don't apply to all Democrats, but generally speaking, most Democrats are more liberal. They favor government intervention to help out the needy. Kind of the role of the government, if people are struggling within society, is to step in and help out those who are in need. You can kind of put that somewhat in the context of contemporary society today and dealing with issues with the pandemic. Whose responsibility is it? Is it the federal government, state government, local government? So a lot of the different issues in terms of government intervention are being played out in the real world today. On the other hand, the conservatives, they favor allowing the free market, private organization, and individuals to take care of those in need. They believe that as the markets kind of get lifted up and businesses begin to expand, then eventually jobs could be available for those who need them, and that would kind of get them back on their feet. Generally speaking, as we head into the 1980s, both Jimmy Carter and the Democrats and Ronald Reagan and the Republicans agree on core American values such as freedom and equality for all citizens. When you look at the broad ideas and goals of liberalism in the 1980s, government should play a larger role in improving the lives of Americans. This would include raising taxes to fund social programs and welfare programs to help the poor, the unemployed, the elderly. They would also favor more laws to protect the rights of minorities and women. They would also favor more regulations for businesses where the government can step in and sometimes put limits or a cap on the amount of money that a business can charge for a product or service. Foreign policy initiatives on the liberal side would be more cooperating with international organizations like the United Nations, kind of work collectively, negotiate more with foreign countries, kind of look for areas in which you might have some common consensus or agreement. So as we move forward when looking at the conservative movement, it's going to get its start here in 1980 with the Reagan candidacy, and it's going to last for roughly a dozen years between the Reagan presidency for 8 years, and then his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, would become president after winning the 1988 election. So there would really be about a 12-year period of time where conservatives are in power. And if you extend that out even further with the second Bush administration, you really end up with a period of time from 1980 to the year 2008. So over that period of time of about 28 years, 20 of those 28 years, a conservative president was in the White House. And if you even want to narrow it down even further, there was a Bush in the White House in terms of the father or the son, either as vice president or president for those same 20 years out of 28. So we look at conservatism, a large central government endangered economic growth. So the more power that the federal or central government would have in the mind of a conservative would be more dangerous to society. It would limit individual choices and freedoms. Conservatives felt that the liberal policies of the 60s and 70s left a legacy of rising inflation, tremendous waste in regard to government spending. They criticized the liberal solution of just throwing money at social problems within society too often. And we see this whether you have a conservative government or a liberal government. Anytime you spend money within the federal government, you end up with a tremendous amount of waste. You may or may not have been reading or watching in the news about some of the stimulus relief that's been put out during the current pandemic. There's people who have been receiving checks for their deceased relatives, and a lot of different groups of people are getting checks just because the government does not necessarily have a efficient system in place to kind of monitor things like that. Conservatives, they sought to reduce taxes, limit the size of government regulation and the size of the government itself. The bigger the government, the bigger the problem would kind of be a philosophy of a conservative. They believe that we should promote economic growth and expansion. Kind of a more extreme conservative during this period of time would be what is it deemed a neoconservative or traditional conservative. They warn about the dangers posed to society by abandoning traditional values in favor of new freedoms, exemplified by the counterculture and advertised by the mass media. When you look at um, other issues, you had situations where when Richard Nixon came into the presidency, he had advocated the philosophy of détente. Détente, of course, was the lessening of tensions between the United States and communist countries like China and the Soviet Union. When you think about the détente policy and realpolitik, kind of practical style of politics, they were looking for ways that we had things in common with China or the Soviet Union, areas where we could work on medicine and space exploration and things like that, and kind of a collective group. Now, with the Reagan administration and his candidacy, it now became a battle of good, meaning the United States, capitalism, democracy, and freedom versus evil, the Soviet Union, and communism. Continuing along, the new right, and remember when you hear the term right, that's synonymous with conservatism and Republicans. The left is liberal or democratic. So the new right's claiming that liberal policies were the cause of stagflation. That was the period of time under Ford and Carter when the economy saw stagnant wages, meaning what wages weren't going up, but prices continued to go up. Unemployment went up. So we had a lot of negative contributing factors all at once. They argued that policies of stagflation under the Carter administration and a little bit under the Ford administration, policies that taxed citizens and businesses too heavily and spent too much money on the wrong programs, was problematic for society. They attacked unfunded mandates. These are programs required by the government, but not funded by the federal government. These are programs that kind of get imposed on towns or states, and then the local town government or the state government has to pay for those programs. They criticized federal welfare programs, which awarded lack of effort. They felt that if you received money from the government, that would be a situation where you would not be motivated to go seek employment. You might find it easier just to collect a check from the government. The Great Society programs from Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency made poverty worse and led to a decline in traditional family structure and values. They felt that affirmative action promoted a reverse form of discrimination. One group that emerged during this period of time in history, late 70s into the 80s, were the Sagebrush Rebels. You can see a couple of the photographs here that are included. They wanted the federal government to release control of Western lands to states and let them decide how best to use the land resources for their economic advantage. So they wanted less government intervention, and even in regard to open space and land in some of the, in particular, Western states. You can see one of the members there wearing a little Sagebrush Rebels jacket. On the right side is kind of the slogan. During the 1970s into the 1980s, we saw the Moral Majority, which was founded by the Reverend Jerry Falwell. This was a political organization that worked towards fulfilling religious goals. It kind of infused politics with religion. They would attempt, many of the members of the moral majority, to get their followers to support conservative candidates. The moral majority opposed several Supreme Court decisions, including those which outlawed religious teachings in schools, which was the Engel versus Vitale case in 1962, and those which legalized abortion, the Roe versus Wade case, one of the most famous cases in American history, which gave the right of a woman to choose to have an abortion if they saw fit, and conservative groups opposed that. They condemned the Equal Rights Amendment. They were not in favor of same-sex or rights of homosexuals. This boosted the Republican Party's chances of winning the presidency by reaching out to Americans who traditionally had not participated in the political process. Demographic trends also boosted conservatism during this period of time, as we're going to see the Democratic trend of the Sun Belt. If you look at the Sun Belt here, we saw a lot of people moving from the Northeast and upper Midwestern areas, which was kind of nicknamed the Rust Belt, parts of Western Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, where a lot of manufacturing began to close up during the 1970s. A lot of these people began moving into the yellow areas, which is the Sun Belt, warmer areas in the country, in particular California, Florida, Texas, Arizona would be kind of the areas in which a lot of people moved. So the movement to suburbia, which struggled during stagflation, we saw the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt turn the Deep South from Democratic leaning to Republican leaning, with the exception, of course, being California. Many of these groups opposed the 1960s civil rights movement as well. Now we're going to watch a little biography on Ronald Reagan's background before we go into the last few slides. All right, hopefully you enjoyed the little video clip there on Ronald Reagan. And we'll just get us back to the next slide. All right, so just summarizing some of the background information on President Reagan. He was born in Dixon, Illinois, February 6, 1911. And some of the things he did included working as a baseball announcer. He was a famous actor. I think he was in over 80 films throughout his time as an actor. You know, he's probably equivalent to like a B movie actor, probably not somebody that you would consider like a, I don't know, Tom Cruise type of headliner, you know, making 20 or $25 million per movie, but rather probably that next tier down. He would go on to be the president of the Screen Actors Guild, which is basically the head of the actors union. He was married twice. He was the first president to be divorced. He was also a governor of California for 2 terms. He was the oldest president ever elected at age 69 in 1980. Had a great sense of humor. He used his storytelling ability to make a point, deflect criticism, win over doubters. He was nicknamed the Great Communicator. To kind of avoid long interviews with the press, he took questions with his helicopter roaring in the background, kind of stepping back as before he can be asked any question. Reagan envisioned a smaller government, a greater America. There's some pictures there. On the left-hand side is one of his motion pictures. You can see him kind of featured in the center. He played a lot of Western movies. He gave a huge speech in 1964 at the Republican National Convention, which kind of got him on the map. He also ran for the nomination for the presidency a couple different times, including in 1976, where he almost defeated Gerald Ford for the nomination. The Reagan Revolution. Although Reagan began his political life as a Democrat, by 1962 he had found his home in the Republican Party. And as I mentioned, in 1966, he became the governor of California. Interestingly enough, it was Richard Nixon who had ran for the California governorship in 1962 and lost. Had Nixon won in 62 as governor of California, it's quite likely Nixon would have run for re-election in 1966, and Reagan would not have been governor of California in 1966. And who knows, maybe Nixon would not have run for president in 1968. Instead, he might have stayed on as the governor of California until 1970. So history could have been quite a bit different had Nixon won the 62 governorship in California. He had trouble meeting the goals of cutting the size of government in California. After 2 terms as governor, he wanted to run for president. Reagan became the hero of the movement that we mentioned before, the New Right. He had a very powerful personality, very optimistic. So when you look at the New Right, coalition of conservative media commentators, we see a lot of that today. Rush Limbaugh would probably be the commentator that's most associated today in contemporary times with the New Right. He's been a radio personality for 25 years or so. Fox News has a lot of ties to the right, not necessarily with their regular news coverage, but some of their commentators at night. They have like a Sean Hannity program, Laura Ingraham. Those are all conservative kind of commentators. Grassroots Christian groups. The New Right endorsed school prayer, deregulation, lower taxes, smaller government, stronger military, the teaching of a Bible-based account of human creation. And they oppose a lot of things such as gun control, abortion rights, same-sex marriage, LGBT rights, the Equal Rights Amendment, affirmative action, nuclear disarmament. Reagan gave the New Right an eloquent and persuasive voice and drew millions of Americans to his side as he moved forward in the 70s into the 1980s. During this period of time, cable TV is emerging throughout the country. So by the late 70s into the early 1980s, many of the New Right preachers spoke on TV. They were nicknamed televangelists. One leader of the New Right was Jerry Falwell. He helped to form the moral majority and give Reagan a lot of support. As we mentioned before, his personality as the great communicator really allowed for him to connect with millions and millions of Americans. At his side was his wife, Nancy Reagan, one of his strongest allies and one of his biggest supporters. In the 1980 election, Reagan, along with his vice presidential running mate, George Herbert Walker Bush, defeated President Jimmy Carter and his VP, Walter Mondale. Interestingly enough, all 4 of those individuals there all would run for the presidency at one point in time, and 3 out of 4 of them would be president. In fact, a little video clip before alluded to Walter Mondale. So after Carter and Mondale lose to Reagan in 1980, in 1984, Mondale gets the Democratic nomination for the presidency and runs against Reagan and Bush, and he loses in 1984. Also, Reagan and the Republicans gained control of the Senate for the first time since 1954. You can see a campaign button on the left-hand side. On the bottom right, you can see Reagan in the dark suit. To Reagan's right is George Herbert Walker Bush, who's his VP. The 2 ladies in blue is Barbara Bush, the wife of George Herbert Walker Bush, and Nancy Reagan's in the red. And then it's Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale who are standing to the far right. And basically they're going out of office, and Reagan and Bush are coming in. And there's the outcome of the election. Kind of a blowout, 489 to 449 in the terms of the electoral vote, with Carter winning Georgia, his home state. Minnesota is the home state of Walter Mondale. So in reality, they didn't really win much more than the home states of the respective candidates, winning West Virginia, the District of Columbia, and Maryland. All right, so that kind of concludes our first look at the Reagan administration. We're going to continue along as we move forward this week.